Well, folks, I I want to thank you again very much. I'm speaking to you from Lutruwita, Tasmania, on the land of the Palawa people. It's such a beautiful place to live, and you know, we feel cut off from mainland publishing, but I like being on the edges, as Margrete said before. Publishing on the margins, publishing for the margins, publishing about the margins, and living on the margins. I was lucky enough to be editing the Hindi and Marathi translations of Dirtland Press's book, Where Happiness Hides, with scholars who I think would say that they had two first languages. They're equally comfortable with Hindi or Marathi and with English. And yet we encountered unexpected challenges. The story by Anthony Bottini is a celebration of the tiny, unnoticed joys that keep reappearing in life, regardless of disappointments, big or small. And I love doing it. And I love the way that the author and Margrete wanted to publish this book free online at first as a gift to children in the middle of the pandemic. Because right from the beginning, I remember my 6-year-old grandson coming home from school. And at that point, it was the coronavirus. And he's a lovely child, he suddenly just screamed at the top of his voice and said, "Will everybody stop talking about corona?" And I had that in the back of my head when Margrete suggested this wonderful strategy of first allowing children of the world to read Where Happiness Hides online for nothing. And then later, we would work to get the book published in hard copy and for sale. And I think it was just a wonderful thing. I think it was nearly the end of Margrete's health at the time. It was very stressful, trying to juggle up to 30 different language translations and all the problems that entailed. But it's really a beautiful experience to think about the way this book evolved. So the story starts like this. Happiness hides in little things. A lady beetle tickling your arm. Buds on twigs. The last raspberry. Finding a letter. Okay, so far so good. You think this is going to be easy until the Hindi and Marathi translators say, yeah, well, raspberries aren't really very well known by Indian children. Yes, you can get them in India, but you're going to be paying top dollar in very upscale delis. So they said, couldn't we just have strawberries? Well, actually, no, because the illustrations have been done and clearly they're on the ends of canes. And they said, oh, what are we going to do? Because these are supposed to be small pleasures available to all children, and raspberries is just going to be totally wrong for that context. What we did was the Hindi and Marathi translation just says berries. And it allows you to kind of infer as a child what kind of berry. We couldn't have raspberries in. Same thing happened in Brazil, by the way. The translation into Portuguese, that Brazilian Portuguese, was raspberries aren't going to work here. Then the scene switches to the beach in the narrative. Warm sand that sticks to toes, ripples at the water's edge, crabs running over rocks, the first bite. Secret tunnels, the smell of rain. Now, traditionally, Indians use the beach quite differently from the ways that most Australians do. Well, for a start, most of them don't live near the beach. And even if they do, they would mostly stroll on the sand or fish from it rather than dig into it. But as an Australian, I went from the sand in that paragraph to those tunnels, and I assumed that children would be digging tunnels in the sand, as I did for half my childhood, I think, and loved the way the water would kind of gradually make it collapse and then you'd build it all up again and so on. But that concept was completely strange to my Indian translators. Later in the text, as it's pulling together all the beautiful little experiences that end in a rainbow, it says puddles beckon. Puddles beckon. Well, I have 3 grandchildren. I have 4, but 3 of them, I can attest the fact that they would find mud or a puddle in a drought, and they'll go straight to it, not just to stamp in it, but to lie in it and pretend to be swimming. And regardless of, like, are all 5-year-olds wearing tutus now for everything? Even if they're wearing a tutu with spangles and sparkles on it, down into the puddle they'll go. Well, not quite that way in India. I hadn't realized how much the assumption of the full meaning of that image depends on a climate where puddles are relatively rare. During the monsoon, for example, the whole city of Mumbai is more than a puddle, it's a raging torrent. You've no doubt seen the footage of the Mumbai trains when they were running, practically as boats going down quite dangerously. Anywhere that would be dry is what beckons, not the rare opportunity to play in the water. I'm studying Hindi and Sanskrit at the moment, and what I love more than anything is the nuancing of words. It took me a long time to realize that when I asked the lecturer the word for lemon, the answer was nimbu, but when I asked for nimbu in the market in Mumbai, I was given limes. The confusion isn't helped by the illustration in most visual dictionaries, which often depict limes in their yellow skin phase, so they actually look like lemons rather than the green skin that most Australians would take as the immediate signal for a lime. To me, etymology is the wonderful record of human history. I love it. I loved learning last week in Hindi class, for example, that one word for your in-laws' house in Hindi is also a word for prison. And just last night in Hindi class, we were reading a story in which a father laments, this old-fashioned father witnessing his daughter's wedding, laments the failure of young girls these days to cry at a wedding. He says education's made them hard. In my day, he says girls used to cry their eyes out right to the village boundaries. That's such an interesting image, because the implication the author is planting there is, of course, wondering whether the crying stops once they are outside the village walls, and whether all the crying inside the village walls are fake in the first place. Well, why do such nuances and word choices and phrases matter to a children's publisher? I think they matter more to us than they do to many publishers for adults, because the stages of language learning are coded with such complexity that in order to demonstrate your membership of various groups, you need to be able to understand what has been up till then a series of secret languages. So why me? And so why Dirt Lane Press? We were just talking before about where we'd met, and I'm not exactly sure where Margrete and I met. I think I was, well, I mean, I knew about Margrete, but I first saw her written work when I was asked to help support Jackie French in her history series, which Margrete had started and then had a new job appointment. And I was just completely floored by the detailed editorial support she was giving this author. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Nobody does that anymore, except me. And I thought that was just fantastic. And then I think the next time we met was at one of her celebrations where she was the publisher at Hardy Grant Little Hare books. So why me though? Why when Margrete suggested joining forces did I immediately think yes? My favorite puzzles in kindergarten were visual ones, where you'd be asked to spot what is wrong with this picture. And I remember loving at the age of 5, being able to spot the smoke from the steam train blowing the wrong way. And I think I left my ability to draw back at the HSC when I decided to become an English teacher rather than a painter. But that eye that helped me at the age of 5 is still useful. I think my wonderful, well, there are a number of friends on screen here today, but I'm so thrilled that Emma Quay and Lisa Shanahan are here, because we have worked as a team on a number of books that are amongst the favourites of my whole career. I think Emma and I might have gone through, I don't know how many drawings, Emma, to get the elbows of that pig right in Reggie and Lou. Emma can draw anything. She could draw standing on a head, but something was going wrong with those elbows. And anyway, what pig sprawls in front of a TV set, you know, and kind of shows us the folds in their elbow fat. But it just wasn't going right. And then finally it did. Thank goodness Emma's still talking to me and she's here today, because she might not have been. Even the ability to do that at speed, to be able to identify the problem, even if not being able to fix it, is useful. I was really exhausted last night after class, and I had to do a final proof on a set of 300 pages. And although I scrolled through them very fast, this morning I see that I actually did pick up the last 30 glitches in the typesetting. And that's purely visual, just scrolling really fast and picking up those problems. So my eye has been useful, but I think also as a publisher, I'm a good listener. That's essential if you want to be a good writer. I learned very early on from writers who said, if you want to know who's the writer in the future in the classroom, it's not the life of the party. It will never be the life of the party. It'll be the quiet kid sitting on the edge of the crowd in the bus, watching everybody else on their way home, doing all that stuff and locking it away in there. Lisa Shanahan knows a lot about that, although she knows very well how to be the life of the party too. But she clearly has observed. Her new book is just absolutely wonderful, Hello World, with its observation of little kids, little moments in their lives, the really exciting stages as they go to school. Oh gosh, my second last grandchild to go to school went recently, and I was so just delighted to see how she loved having a school bag and loved having a school uniform. You know, I've worked a lot in India. I've never, ever heard an Indian student express boredom, anger at having to do homework, anger at having to go 6 days a week to class and travel 2 or 3 hours in the train to get there. Never. So there are cultural differences here that interest me as a listener and a reader and a publisher. So I think being a good listener does help if you want to be a good writer, a good editor, and a good friend. A marketing colleague of mine in-house at one major publisher once reported to me a query that some customers had with a book of mine that she was promoting. And I said, well, tell them about chapter 3, you know, where, and she said, oh, I haven't read the book. I obviously looked shocked. And she said, I should be able to sell a book effectively without having read it. Truthfully, when you look at the number of books a sales rep has to recommend to a bookseller each week, that has to be right. Because there are 1,000 new titles published in Australia every week. And even if your company publishes only a 20th of them, that's still more books than you could have time to read. And yet, as a bookseller too in the past, I know that parents and therefore teachers and librarians need to know and trust what they're told about a new book. They're trying to match it with a specific child or a group of children, and they're trying to meet developmental criteria as well as cultural criteria. I learned very early on when a teacher complained to a bookseller friend that she had not been warned about the offensive language that she discovered in a novel that she'd bought. And she said to this high-profile bookseller, well, I'll never trust you again. Really? She cares that much about the bad language in one book? The sort of commitment that that woman was signaling is what I love about publishing for children, and it's also what drives me absolutely nuts. In my life, booksellers and librarians have often been wrong. I came to think it was a great selling technique. I'd walk into my favorite bookshop and the owner would walk towards me with a book in hand and say, I've got just the book for you. And you know what? It's so hard to walk away when somebody says that to you. So yeah, well, you might be right, but you know, I'm not buying. You can't do it. So it's a very effective technique. Teachers have been wrong too. When I was leaving school, a teacher who I'd never liked said to me with concern, Mark Macleod, a book I want you to read is Room at the Top. Well, everybody's forgotten Room at the Top. But 50 years later, you know what? I'm still wondering what she thought I needed to read from that book. I don't know. Was it about an unwanted pregnancy? Was it about, you know, getting a quick curry down your gut so that you have the quick birth. I don't know what it was about, but she seemed to think I needed to read that book. And here I am 50 years later, I've remembered it. I did actually read the book a long time ago. At our produce market in Hobart, there's a much loved jam seller. He's got jams made from berries that I've barely heard of. I said to him the first time I went to the store, what do you recommend? And he looked at me like I was crazy. They're all great. He said, you can taste all of them if you like. I knew that I didn't have time. And I knew that trying one after the other times 12 would probably confuse me anyway. And I asked him what was the difference between youngberry and loganberry, because he obviously wanted me to be interested in the specifics of his work. And he looked very energized and he said, well, youngberry is much like blackberry, but loganberry is quite different and tangy. I tried both of them and he was absolutely right. Then I said, and what about mulberry? He said, oh, well, that one's unique. It's kind of earthy. You can't liken it to any of the others, he said. I tried that and he was absolutely right again. So I bought loganberry and mulberry. See, even in jams, I'm not the sort of shopper who buys what he already knows, except that now I always drift towards the loganberry and I will until I get another experiment paying off for me. A real matter of concern out of all this for me is our aversion to risk. One of the writers in Australia I'm very fond of, John Marsden, always writes in the front of books, take risks. It's such a smart thing to write. He's been writing it for decades now. It's a complex issue. Before I moved to Tasmania, I spent 10 years in a university where most of my influential colleagues were in social work. And we've argued repeatedly, endlessly, about the need for trigger warnings on books. In some specific instances, I can understand the need, rather like the on-screen warnings that what you're about to watch includes the names of deceased Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I get that. That's very important to their culture. Or the warnings that people who have a physical response to flashing lights on screen might need to be cautious with the movie they're about to see. But imposing a general ban on content that might be triggering, where would that stop? The demands for content advisory stickers on books were raging at the beginning of my publishing career. At most gatherings, I think this has been happening to me for 40 years. At most gatherings, parents would stand up, somebody would stand up and say, why won't you publishers put warning stickers on your books? One answer was that in the film world, classification had basically wrecked the G rating for general exhibition. When my children were small, they read that as advice to avoid a babyish movie. Bad language warnings on CDs sent the sales of stickered CDs through the roof. So we're very perverse as humans. As soon as you give us those warnings, we're going to do the exact opposite. I learned that as a bookseller. Maybe there are some booksellers who'll confirm this with me, but I loved as a bookseller being asked, what are the 3 best books to give child this age? And you go, I've been waiting my whole life for somebody to ask me this question. And you go, this one, this one, this one. And if you are on the spot and it's busy in the shop and you go, oh, this one's a bit dodgy, but I'll suggest it anyway. You go, this one's definitely interesting to you. This one, I don't know. This one's definitely, you know which one they'll buy? Number 2, always. It's always the one you said they might not like, or they probably won't like. So now, is that a cultural pattern? Probably. I think Australians are quite perverse. And I am very aware that as a bookseller, I was castigated by a number of purchasers who wanted to show me that they knew more about books than I did. That's fine. The customer's always right. Well, the customer's very often wrong, but, I obeyed that sort of expectation. But it's really interesting the number of times when you recommend against a book that somebody takes it. Apart from the few specific warnings I've referred to list the elements of a book that might be offensive would deny children agency, wouldn't it? The best thing about this is that we have a high degree of control when we read a book. If it looks as if it's wandering into offensive territory or boring territory, we can simply stop reading. And we do all the time. I started reading, I won't just say which one, I started reading one of the shortlisted books for the Booker Award, and I've stopped. The sentences were too long, and I wasn't feeling like that level of thought process at 11 o'clock at night, and so on. Our children stop reading. Even when we try to force them to keep reading by means of examinations or reading challenges, I've said to a couple of people that I would love the sales of The Dream Peddler to be higher. When you hear the author telling her own personal story, as Margrete said, it's absolutely riveting. Her tears would have made me want to buy the book, whether I were one of the publishers or not. But a couple of people said to me, oh, I know why people might not buy that book. The illustrations are scary. Margrete showed you the illustrations. They're referring to 2 illustrations out of 15. The point of those illustrations is that they are scary. The book ends with light and ends with an open door and ends with reconciliation and optimism and so on. It's a very beautiful ending. It's very satisfying. There are 2 scary pages, and they're not really that scary. There's just some imagery there that if you read it in the context of other things, you might be a little bit sort of unsettled by it. I don't know. If you want confronting, go back to Grimm's fairy tales, or even Anderson's for that matter. Maria Tatar's anthology of classic fairy tales starts with a version of Red Riding Hood that has a bottle of grandma's blood on a shelf in the pantry. Tell me what's scary. I'm old-fashioned enough to be with Bettelheim on this. The great thing about those stories is that they do allow children agency. Robert Cormier was always right. You can't force a child to read a book that they're not ready to read. And Cormier wasn't just talking about lexical readiness. We've tried. If the story is not to your liking, stop reading. Really easy. Don't buy the book. I'm fine with that. My most recent experience with this was Netflix. I was moaning about the violence and sexism of what passed for trending now on Netflix. And a room of people from a different generation just looked at me sympathetically and said, algorithms. You must have been watching some and now it's giving you more. The implication was more of what I want. But that isn't all I want. I said, so how do I fix that? Well, Granddad, one of them said, you need to start watching some rom-coms and the algorithm will change for you. Let me tell you, I tried and the options were pathetic. So even if it's going to change my algorithm, I am not going to watch those rom-coms. So don't tell me it's only what my behavior predicts that I want, that I should have. When I started working at Charles Sturt University, I had to pass a subject, much to my fury, that emphasized constructive alignment. It was spoken of in hushed tones by the education lecturer. Every outcome of any course I wrote had to be measured against specific aims. Obviously, in general terms, I'm always aware of where we might end up and how we might start. But some of my best learning moments have been surprises. I think back on some personal growth workshops encouraging change. If you always do what you've always done, then you'll always get what you've always got. I want a story to have the capacity to surprise me. I want young readers to be able to see what I haven't seen in the story, to have a new understanding that I haven't predicted. I want to learn from young readers. I want them to see when the smoke's blowing the wrong way. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful too.